How are you doing? Thanks for joining us this morning. My name is Keith McMaw. I'm a Senior Manager in PwC's Digital and Forensic Investigations practice. And today we're going to talk through advanced analytics to detect and proactively prevent procurement fraud. So to begin with, by background, I'm a forensic accountant, so I'm not going to get into the advanced analytics. I'll leave that to my colleagues, but I'm just going to set a bit of the backdrop to fraud generally by drawing upon some global research that PwC has conducted in relation to fraud. I'm also just going to look a little bit around the pandemic and how that's changed the fraud risk landscape over the past 18 months. I'm also joined by Michael Abraham. He's going to look at some of the more traditional fraud detection methods, and then he's going to look at the use of analytics to help with supply chain resilience, which again is particularly important with the pandemic. Stuart then is going to discuss continuous analytics and continuous monitoring and the use of more advanced analytics to protect against procurement fraud. There will be some time for a Q&A at the end, so please do feel free to ask any questions that you have. So in terms of the backdrop of fraud and the current threats that are out there, every 2 years PwC conducts a global economic crime survey, where it conducts a survey of between 5,000 and 7,000 business leaders globally, just to understand what their experiences are with fraud over the past 2 years. So on the slide here, you can see some of the UK statistics that we've seen. So you can see that in the UK, 56% of our respondents have said that they've experienced fraud in the past 2 years. This is actually the highest level of fraud that we've seen since the surveys began, and it's significantly higher than the global rate of 47%. Of these frauds, 57% were at the hands of an external perpetrator. And right at the top of that list is suppliers and vendors, which really just shows the risk around procurement fraud facing organisations today. 24% are at the hands of an internal perpetrator, and the vast majority of these individuals are middle and senior management. And then, quite surprisingly to me actually, about 17% of all reported UK fraud is through collusion between an internal and external perpetrator. And we're not going to get into it today, but particularly around procurement, what we find is collusion is extremely difficult to detect and to prove that that has happened. In terms of some of the most common frauds that we're seeing, 42% is in relation to cybercrime, again, top of the list, same as 2018. This is closely followed by customer fraud, which is fraud committed against you by a customer at 33%. Then accounting fraud at 26%, and bribery and corruption at 25%. In terms of detecting fraud, internal audit remains the most effective way to detect fraud within an organisation through the usual internal audit programme. But this is closely followed by suspicious activity monitoring, with 11% of fraud detected through this, and that's something that we're going to talk about today, and the technology that can be used. So it's clear that the fraud remains a challenge for UK business leaders, but actually how has the pandemic changed the fraud landscape over the past 18 months? We see four main areas in which COVID-19 has increased fraud threat over the past 18 months. So internal fraud, it's clear that many organisations are not going to be hitting their targets as a result of the pandemic, and this may have a very real impact upon share prices, banking covenants, or even the bonus pool that's available to senior managers. So this increases the real risk of financial reporting discrepancies and ultimately gives an added incentive for internal players to effectively fudge the numbers and create fake financial reporting. In terms of opportunistic attacks, it's clear that with management preoccupied with a response to COVID-19 and also with the significant change to our working practices with many of us working at home, much of the workforce working at home, that there are opportunities for criminals to look for opportunities with regards to weak IT systems or in fact just weak controls that aren't geared up for the new working practices that we've all experienced. And actually Michael is going to talk a little bit later on around some of the more traditional fraud detection methods, one of which is red flag testing. And one of those red flags would be traditionally looking at, an employee that's posting late journals late in the evening or journals at the weekend. And maybe 2 years ago, we would have thought, well, actually, maybe that's a bit of a red flag or a risk. But actually, with our change of working practices, the nightmare of homeschooling and all of that, many of us are working in the evenings and weekends. So actually, COVID has actually impacted our methods of detection, and that's bringing more into some of the advanced analytics that perhaps Stuart's going to talk about later on. In terms of supply chain and third-party risk, I'm not going to talk about it in detail as Michael's going to talk about it, but at a very high level, some of the traditional controls that we would see around bringing a new supplier into an organization, or some of the due diligence that we would often see in relation to a new third party just isn't happening as a response to a supply chain breaking down as a result of the pandemic. Then finally, just broader financial crime. We've seen an increase in tax evasion, accounting misrepresentation, and bribery and corruption as a result of the pandemic. But it's not just in the private sector that we've seen this. Some people may have seen the Audit Office investigation report in November 2020, which investigated the government procurement practices as a result of the pandemic. And as a result of the pandemic, the government entered into 8,600 new contracts with a value of £18 billion. 94% of these contracts were new suppliers, new contracts, which carries a significant amount of risk. And actually 10 billion of the £18 billion spent on these contracts was as a result of a direct award contract with no competition. So I think this really just highlights the importance of having effective mechanisms around procurement fraud, particularly during the pandemic. About 80% of that spend would have been in relation to PPE, which obviously was significantly important at the start of the pandemic. But actually, it's important to have those technologies, the continuous monitoring, in order to deal with the changing risk as a result of the pandemic. Just very, very quickly, in terms of managing the impact of COVID-19, we're seeing, organizations trying to improve their governance structures, so ensuring that policies have been updated to reflect the new working practices and to reflect the changes of business because of the pandemic. Also, undertaking regular risk assessments will act to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 and making sure that those risk assessments are in line with the new working practices within an organisation. The main one we're going to focus on today is the use of technology to identify the fraud, particularly procurement fraud, in both a comprehensive and efficient way. Just before I pass over to the guys to talk about the tools that are available, I just want to bring it back to the Global Economic Crime Survey to see what organisations currently are doing globally in terms of fighting fraud. So it is very clear from the 2020 survey that businesses are using technology to fight against fraud. Globally, 67% of business leaders say that they are using technology to monitor transactions and to fight against fraud. And of this number, 81% are actually currently using or plan to use AI in the fight against fraud. In terms of the UK perspective, I think it's clear from our 2018 survey that technology was being underused in the fight against fraud, but we have seen a shift in 2020. Again, we've seen quite a large numbers using anomaly detection and AI, or in fact planning to use these tools. In 2020, 4% of all UK reported frauds were detected through the use of analytics in some way, which is a significant increase from 1% in 2018. But I think there are still some key blockers in the way of using this technology. Cost is a blocker, maybe the availability of resources or SMEs in the organisation, a lack of management support, and actually quite worryingly, 12% of business leaders told us that they simply didn't think that the investment was worth it when it came to fraud. So it is clear that more can be done to capitalise the technology that is available to detect fraud. I'm just going to pass over to Michael, who's going to talk about some of these tools now.
Thanks, Keith, and good morning, everyone. As Keith said, my name's Michael Abraham. I'm a manager in our forensic analytics practice, and my work involves all things procurement frauds, from more traditional techniques to some of the more advanced stuff. I want to start my kind of speech or presentation today just talking about some of our more traditional methods before I hand over to Stuart, who'll look at some of our more advanced methods. But when we say procurement fraud, traditional detection methods, what do we mean? Well, there's kind of 2 or 3 key areas that I want to touch on today. And the first one, which Keith has mentioned already, is red flag testing. And it is, I would say by far and away one of our most common methods that we would use to try and detect procurement fraud, potentially in those reactive situations, which we're quite often working on. Why is it beneficial? Well, it kind of gives you a health check of all things procurement. It's quick and relatively easy to implement, and quite often a lot of these red flag tests don't need specialist software to get a result. So we see a real use case for using red flag testing, not in all scenarios, but in most scenarios we do. On the right-hand side of the slide, I've kind of listed some of our, procurement fraud red flag tests from our suite of tests that we would typically include in some of our engagements. If I just talk through some of them, just to give a bit more context as to what they are. So if we look at the third one down, so we would check, do vendors and employees have matching addresses? Do they have shared bank accounts? That would automatically trigger something potentially a little bit suspicious in what we're seeing in our procurement data. In the middle of the screen, bank account reversal. So are we seeing suppliers who on one day have one bank account set of details, and then the next day they're reversed or changed and then reversed back shortly after? That may indicate a period of suspicious activity that we may want to investigate further. And then towards the bottom, segregation of duties. So understanding the kind of chain of command, who has raised an invoice for payment, and then who's actually approved that. Was that the same person? If so, why was that? And is there something that needs to be investigated further? So to summarize, red flag tests are valuable, they're very important, but I will say that they come with their limitations. Fraudsters are becoming more and more savvy as time goes on. They're becoming aware of what these red flag tests are, and they know how to dodge them. Red flag testing will often give a binary result, yes or no, this is wrong, or this is right, and sometimes doesn't kind of factor in certain scenarios which may be applicable to certain businesses, and therefore results need to be taken, I guess, with a little bit of pinch of salt, and further work needed, and further context needed to be applied to the results. But I think one of the biggest barriers with red flag testing, which we've experienced, is actually interpreting the results. You get a lot of noise and potentially a lot of false positives as well. And it's sometimes difficult to interpret the results. You've applied a series of red flag tests over your procurement transactions, and you're left with the question of asking, well, so what? What do I need to do? What is this telling me? And that's a challenge that we face quite often. But I'll come on to how we combat that later on. And just to go through some of the red flag tests that I was talking through earlier, I guess as time progresses, some of these maybe just aren't as anomalous as what they first seem. So around some amounts, quite often not very suspicious. As Keith mentioned, postings late at night as we kind of transition into a 24/7 working world. That's not really very uncommon anymore. And looking at vendors who only are interacting with a small number of times, again, becoming more popular as global supply chains increase. I guess the second traditional method that I want to look at is scenario-based testing. So kind of stepping away from red flag tests, but having a look at a scenario. And quite often we apply these scenario-based tests when it comes to whistleblower allegations. So a company has come to us and they have a whistleblower who suspects that something dodgy is happening with a particular employee or at a particular time period or with a particular supplier. And what we'd want to do here is try and understand, A, can we substantiate those whistleblower allegations? And 2, can we quantify any figures behind them? So we have a look at this visual on screen. That kind of gives a nice idea of a scenario-based test that we would quite often perform on procurement systems. So having a look potentially at a supplier who's had no transactions for a very long period of time, 12 to 18 months, and then all of a sudden their bank account changes. And then from that particular point in time onwards, all following transactions are posted by a single user. Again, may not be anything suspicious. Potentially the bank account details just needed to be updated. But if the whistleblower had alleged something suspicious at a particular point in time with a particular supplier, this is the type of scenario-based test that we could run to try and substantiate and quantify those allegations. I think the final part of traditional fraud fraud detection methods, and something that can be applied, of course, to more advanced methods is the kind of power of visualization. And it ties into what I was saying earlier about a lot of noise around red flag testing. Visualization can help kind of tell the story and paint a picture and make it quite easy to spot anomalies in the data. So having a look at the left-hand side on the chart here, so having a look at invoices that have been raised and approved by the same user, potentially looking at this in a tabular format, potentially in Microsoft Excel, it would be difficult to interpret the results and see that Alex 15 user has had a high number of invoices approved, raised and approved by them. So something interesting that quite easy to spot through the power of visualization. And on the right-hand side, similarly, what's the impact here is actually being used in the color of our scatter graphs. So each dot represents a vendor, and we're having a look for round sum amounts as well. So quite easy to spot the anomalies within here as well. I just want to spend about the next few minutes talking through how we've used red flag testing, scenario-based testing, and the power of visualization into one of a case study that we've been recently worked on at PwC. So we were approached by a UK environmental company, and they had alleged, and there was a whistleblower allegation, that one of their members of staff had been conducting payroll frauds within the company, and they engaged PwC to try and substantiate the payroll accusations, but also have a look at their procurement data as well, as this employee in question was also overseeing their procurement function. So we had a look at some of their data. We applied red flag testing, scenario-based testing, and we were able to visualize the results. And just to talk through some of the results you see on the right-hand side, so what we were able to identify was that this particular employee in question has set up 3 different suppliers: a recruitment supplier, a fuel supplier, and a drainage supplier. And all suppliers shared the same bank account. And through working with the police, we were able to identify that that bank account was directly being funded into that employee's bank account. And we can see the trend over time from 2017 to 2019 of just how much more confident this employee became when setting up these suppliers. So in 2017, they started out relatively small, working their way up to 2019, obviously gaining more confidence as they thought they could get away with it. So that kind of finishes my little piece on traditional fraud detection methods. I do want to spend around 5 minutes now talking around some of the work we've been doing on procurement analytics and supply chain resilience. And again, we're kind of stepping away from procurement fraud here, but very relevant topic at the minute, and something which we've been working on closely in PwC. So over the course of the last 18 months, I'm sure most of you will have seen a headline looking something quite similar to one on screen. We can't escape supply chain problems in the market at the minute. And there's been a 5-fold increase over the past year of companies who have experienced severe disruption in their supply chain. And a few of these are listed on the screen now. I'll just talk through a few of them. So whether it be the Suez Canal incident, where we had a 9 billion pile-up of stock in one day, or whether it be the impacts of Brexit, especially here in Northern Ireland, where a couple of weeks ago, Marks & Spencer's announced that it would not be providing its Christmas food services to Northern Ireland this year. And of course, most recently in the news in the last couple of weeks on coronavirus, which has had a major impact on supply chain resilience, with the wholesale gas prices last week, but also this week with our fuel shortages as well. And so in PwC, we've been working with a lot of companies to try and understand how we can use analytics to detect vulnerabilities and weaknesses in the supply chain. And I want to talk through now just exactly how we do that. So quite often we're working with companies who are under pressure to meet global deadlines, to finish their projects and to deliver on budget. And they want to understand which suppliers in their supply chain are weak, vulnerable, and which may impact them in completing their work. And so what we can provide in PwC is a resilience model, which brings in data from numerous different sources, as we can see on the left-hand side. So what we can do is we can have a look at financial health data, so understanding has a supplier or has a particular supplier been weak or vulnerable throughout the start of the pandemic? Having a look at their operations and delivery, so they're delivering on time and are they due to meet their budgets. Finally, we're also able to gather market sentiment analysis from news articles to understand what's being said about particular suppliers in the market right now. Have they cut jobs? Have they put staff back on furlough? Have they lost contracts? And by feeding in all this different data metrics into our resilience model, we can quickly identify suppliers who are low resilience. We can combine that by understanding as well, through the power of data, which suppliers are highly critical to a company's supply chain. So on one stand, you've got the resilience, but on the other stand, you also need to understand how critical they are to a supplier's function. So what would be the revenue impact on a particular company if a supplier was to stop trading tomorrow? Or how long would it take to replace if a supplier collapsed? And are they a single source provider? So through the power of resilience data and through the power of criticality data, we can quite quickly give companies a really good indication of a subset of suppliers which they need to focus in on and understand, do we need to take further action? We would then visualize this outputs through the power of visualization to understand A, geographical risks, understand supply chain resilience trends over time, and give them the power to drill into particular suppliers to understand, do we need to take specific actions or do we need to think about replacing a particular supplier? And this provides various benefits to our clients. And finally, I just want to touch on some of the other work that we do on supply chain resilience. So from using our, data-driven approach to understand which suppliers are vulnerable and which may need to be replaced. And they may want to procure additional suppliers and understand, well, what are the risks if we procure supplier A, supplier B, or supplier C. And we offer a range of services here, from due diligence, so understanding their HR record over time, or understanding their financial position before procurements. And this can be applied for vendors, suppliers, JVs, agents, and brokers alike. And I guess once they have been procured, that's only the first phase. We can then continuously monitor those suppliers and understand any adverse media that is being taken on board by those suppliers. And so from procurement right through to contract ends, we're able to support clients in their supply chain resilience and also their continuous monitoring. So that's all I wanted to say for now. I'm now going to hand over to Stuart to talk around some of our more advanced analytics techniques.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Keith. Hopefully everybody can hear me in the back. So I'm Stuart McKenzie, Senior Manager in our Digital Investigations team. And I focus more recently on looking at really advanced techniques and how we can really start to make some effort against I think some of the challenges that we've seen over the last few years in terms of detecting fraud in procurement data. And I guess the first thing that I would talk about is sort of moving from a place where we do sort of one-off fraud detection exercises around a company's procurement data, whether it be in a manual system or a large-scale ERP system like SAP, and looking at how we continuously monitor for fraud in there. And actually, whenever you move to continuous platform like this, you get a lot more options open to you in terms of how you can detect fraud. And so, for example, we have developed a tool called Procurement Protect, which hooks directly into clients' data feeds and has a number of different features to help detect fraud. And so a lot of that kind of comes down to the traditional techniques. So all of those red flags, all of those scenarios that Michael talked about are embedded within here. But then where actually you get the real power is now you've got the ability to tag and review and look at these incidents. And actually, as you start to tag and review them, machine learning in the background then enables us to be able to understand, well, actually for this client or for this vendor, what's a really, really important thing, or perhaps for a user, what their profile looks like. And so users who typically, start posting and start doing their work late in the evenings, and now that red flag, we kind of see it and we're like, well, actually, this is not a red flag for that user, and we can learn about that and now flag the really important transactions. Alongside sort of all of those supervised techniques that you have for detecting fraud once you've been able to tag them, one of the big drawbacks really to red flag testing and scenario testing is actually that the only way to detect those types of schemes is once you know about them. And what about the schemes that we don't know about? Those are the really interesting ones, the new novel approaches that the criminals are having to procurement fraud. And so we can use techniques such as anomaly detection built into a platform like this to then start saying, well, hey, actually this isn't a known fraud scheme, but this just really looks very interesting. Like this user posted to this account, or they did it at this time of day, which is actually fine usually, but they don't work on Tuesdays. So that's what's interesting, and these things would be really, really difficult to look at as a series of red flags. And this is, I guess, for us, where like machine learning is obviously, a classical use case is actually you've got all of these indicators of fraud, but it's the very subtle combinations of these flags together, and only for in particular scenarios where they become really interesting, and that's part of the power of this. And then, alongside that, you have your vendor hijacking, false invoicing schemes, all built in. And then we also can take it further. So, I think Michael talked about, user approver interaction, and somebody approving their own PO that they've raised. But now you can actually start to look at something like the graph of all of the user interactions and note, well, actually, is there a particular user and approver, not the same person, but who constantly interact with each other? And is there a strange relationship there? And he's got his buddy essentially to approve a lot of fake invoices from. So this is where this collusion piece starts to become easier to see whenever there's really, really strong interactions like that. I guess I'll also talk about NLP a bit. So this is typically an area that we haven't always been able to utilize, I guess, fraud detection techniques that strongly and in the past. And so it's the ability for us to be able to compare like duplicate invoices, where typically we might have just looked at the posting date and maybe the amount, and actually you get lots and lots of false positives. But through NLP, we can then start to understand, well, like what's the descriptors on these invoices for these expenses or for the items you're procuring? Like, are they the same? Are they different? And we can really add an additional lens here that helps us to weed out and get down to the really, really core things that you might want to review. And then actually, taking that one step further is then actually, do you really understand all of the things that your company are procuring? And could you do something really advanced, like what we did here, which was to group all of the procurement lines based on their line descriptions together. So, IT equipment is all grouped together, and you can start the machine sort of understanding what these things are. And then actually you see the different clusters, the different amounts you're spending in them, and you can really identify the really rare things that you're procuring. So these are like the things that whenever you look at the cluster, they're dot out by themselves, right? Actually, just for part of visual inspection of this, I can go and say, well, hey, who was the supplier? What was this invoice for? Who was the user that raised it? Who approved it? But also similarly, you get this really unique understanding, and actually, you could just say here, well, who is flagged as not, a user that would typically be in this sense. So there's a lot of analytical richness you can get from this type of analysis. And then, if we move on to sort of the last sort of thing I'll talk about this morning, which is this idea of process mining. So actually looking at the different events that happen to something that you're procuring. So you'll go through this sort of pattern of, right, okay, so you've got to raise a purchase order, then you've got to have somebody who's going to approve that, then somebody's going to raise an invoice against that purchase order, again has to be approved, has to draw down against it, and eventually a payment made. And actually, if you look at the pattern of how these things are raised and approved and how they go through your system, then you'd probably want to assume that everything would have like a fairly standard structure and goes through like a pretty controlled process. But actually, through process mining, you can look at, well, actually, do certain things take a different path through my procurement process? And if so, why? And is there something interesting there that we need to be aware of or looking at? I mean, it's a really good method for just understanding your process in general. So just even beyond fraud, for finding efficiencies in your procurement process and understanding, where you might have things going wrong. So those are sort of the three main concepts I want to talk about from an advanced sort of detection standpoint this morning. And we'll move on to the Q&A.